And I called it a panel, but it's the two of us, so it's not really a panel, I suppose. Conversation, again, one that we invite you to actively participate in. And frankly, I think this is maybe one of the most exciting conversations because I think this is what hits home to all of us. We all somewhere work, and maybe it's in our house or in our home or Starbucks, or maybe sometimes we do work in an office, and thinking about creating innovative environments that make us more productive and work smarter is really what our friends and partners at HOK Architects do. And I'll ask Lisa, is this breaking up, stopping too? So we have Lisa joined from HOK Architects. HOK is helping Cisco to design all our offices worldwide, all our 22 million square feet-ish or so. You'll also see if you visit any of our Cisco offices that we have some standards in terms of look and feel, and so they're helping really kind of scale that. But who better to kind of explain and introduce HOK than Lisa herself? So Lisa, maybe we'll start there. Can you share who you guys are and what you guys do?
Sure. So HOK is an architectural firm. We are a global firm that practices not only in architecture, but we practice in architecture, interior design, urban planning. We do a lot of consulting on a strategic research perspective. So it's a really integrated practice that is global. And we have offices in 25 locations globally, about 1,800 personnel. And we really focus on bringing that research and innovation and sharing that with our clients for best practices and to elevate the role of design and the role of architecture in, within building solutions, but also in shaping the way we're impacting environments and shaping the way we're impacting people in those environments. So there's a tremendous sensitivity and commitment within HOK to practice sustainably and to always be aware of the contextuality of place and people and the intersection and the impact that that has on environment. So with that, that's a brief intro of HOK. I could certainly go on for a long time, but the focus really is about the integrated practice. And as professionals, rather than working in silos, we really share, even internally, those best practices to make sure that, just as you were speaking earlier about the integrated technology and building infrastructure, we're trying to incorporate principles of integration in everything that we do. So from building envelope to interior of the workplace to sustainable communities and environments, there's an intersection in all of those that are really, really critical. And if we're thinking of them holistically, we're much more able to design effectively in a way that impacts people positively in our environments. So that's just it.
Yeah, great. Not that it's your fault, but my first job, I tried to work for HOK and they didn't hire me. I'm an architect by training, and that's like 20 years ago, so don't worry about it. But, what I wanted to kind of talk is kind of go back a little bit, and kind of the journey of the change of space and design. When I joined Cisco, we had cubicles yay high, and it's, you know, and that probably was very common back then.
They still exist.
They still exist, and I think they even call them cube farms.
Yes. Dilbert syndrome.
Yeah. So could you describe what an office, you say it still exists, but I guess so maybe still, but what were some of the key design drivers back then, and maybe people mattered less, and maybe you just indicated maybe it's more about the people. So kind of where do you see some of the changes happened that have driven to completely rethinking about space and work design?
So the Dilbert syndrome, just to begin there, was sort of an outcome of industrialization, mass production, moving from production line into mass workforce, repeatable tasks, very task-oriented type of work. And as we move to a more knowledge-based work and thought leadership and project work, teamwork, there's been a shift in the workplace and how it responds to those types of activities. So if we go back to the early 80s, space was really an allocation that was tied to hierarchy or legacy within an organization. So if you were a long-term employee, if you were high up on the hierarchical ladder in the C-suite and upper management, the allocation of space associated with that was a larger footprint. So we saw a lot of large offices, a lot of executive enclaves, and the workstation was much larger as well, and it emulated an office because they were still important people working for those organizations, but they didn't get hard walls, they got very high panels. So a number of people working in offices, working independently, heads down, doing repeatable tasks, no need to talk, just produce. And so as we moved more towards project and team collaborative work and thought leadership, what happened was people needed to talk more. So then we ran into an issue where meeting rooms were oversaturated, nobody was sitting at their desk, you didn't know if anybody was there because the panels were still high. So by the early, late 80s, the 80s were, very good time for organizations around the profitability side. There was a lot of spending in environments. Nobody was really that concerned about the size or the cost of real estate. But when we entered the 90s and the recession that hit then, there was a very different perspective on opulence. There was a different perspective on allocation of space. And the pendulum swung completely to the other side. So rather than having private offices and open workstations, there was a shift to one size fits all. We're going to go all open. We're going to downsize all offices to one size as much as possible. And that was sort of the next wave of workplace. But the reality is we know that one size doesn't really fit all. And the shift in going from a private office environment to an open workstation environment or open plan environment, which is what we call it now, it requires change management. And so all of this was done without any real thought around how that was going to impact the employee. So over the last 10 years, what we've been doing is really working with organizations to understand impact to employee, impact to productivity, impact to innovation and collaboration, and coming up with new models of working. And it's bringing us back to the middle of that spread, where we're looking at spaces that reflect a work type or work functionality rather than spaces that are truly just designed to respond to a space reduction. And those are the spaces that are incredibly interesting at the moment, and we can go into more detail on that, but I wasn't sure if you had a next question before that.
So some of the reasons, and you mentioned people, but we'll talk about people later. How was the environment and energy a driver in thinking differently about space, consumption?
Well, the consumption on a square footage utilization basis. So the consumption really came out of a need to reduce cost of real estate. The employee wasn't necessarily considered in that equation as much as we would have liked. But if you look at the employee cost of an organization, your overall human capital cost on running an organization is somewhere between 70 and 80, and sometimes up to 85%, whereas the cost of real estate and your facility operations is usually around 9%. So to invest a little bit more in the 9% to then engage and activate productivity for your 75% is what people started to look at. And in doing so, we started to design spaces that, again, really responded to work function. So how do you define work function when you've got an organization of 3,000 people? So it's really about studying, doing observational research to understand human behavior, patterns of working, why do they collaborate, when do they come together, when do they disband, what does heads down work look like? Is it all day? Is it part of the day? Is it a percentage of the day? And so we started to categorize types of work and types of functionality. So we still have a lot of heads down users. We have some organizations who are very highly collaborative, like a Google, for example, or Facebook. We have some organizations who are really a bridge of hierarchy and a bridge of control. and how do we move those organizations into a more compatible, team-based and project-oriented workflow so that there is conversation, there is convergence of different departments and business units within those organizations to move the business forward and to bring innovation into their business. So in doing all of that, we've come up with mobile workers, anchor workers, distributed work models, and what that means is it's not one size fits all. There are many, many different responses to workplace and work types that have been developed over the last 10 years to address those issues, but primarily to ensure that the workforce is engaged and active in the work that they're doing, and that there's a sense of community. So we did a study with Humana, and that study indicated that any employees who are actively engaged in a social network at the office are 7 times more likely to be engaged in their work and 7 times more likely to be able to engage clients in what they do. So the level of social network and level of engagement in the workforce directly equates to productivity and engagement with clients and the client experience.
You may say social active is within an office environment, or so you, as a result, that triggered, again, new kinds of space design, social spaces where we gather, I guess?
So what we're seeing now in a distributed work model is a move away from one-to-one seating, so where we have 1 seat per employee, and going to 1 seat for every 2 employees. Through our observational research, we noted that on average, anywhere from 40 to 60% of the workplace was vacant due to illness, absenteeism, vacation, travel, or people just being in meetings. And if you look at that statistic and equate that to real estate dollars, it's a very high percentage of space that's being underutilized on a regular basis. And the same goes with meeting rooms. Most meeting rooms are underutilized about 30% of the time, or you will find 2 or 3 people in a meeting room for a meeting room that seats 8 to 10 people. So how do we better utilize that space by designing spaces that are more adaptable and more fluid? And one of the ways we are doing that is what we call alternative workplace strategy. And it's using a concierge and booking system to book your workstation for the day. It's unassigned, 100% unassigned. And in doing that, you're booking it for blocks of time, there's an opportunity to increase utilization up to 90%. We're seeing ratios of 2 to 1, in some cases 3 to 1, so 3 employees to 1 seat. But what that does is there's more of a need to come to the office to connect, come to the office to collaborate, and choose where you're going to sit so that you can co-locate with a project team, or co-locate for a particular assignment, or co-locate with with employees that just you're socially connected with for the day, so that you're always feeling connected to the organization. And that flexibility is what we're seeing as being absolutely critical to increase productivity and innovation. GlaxoSmithKline, one of the facilities that we've designed for them, they went to a completely unassigned seating model, and they said within 6 months, 50% of email decreased. So the email of the groups that were functioning in this way, their email decreased 50%, and their decision making went up 25%. So rather than sitting on the other side of the floor plate, they chose to sit and co-locate when they needed to do group work, and they chose to sit and have heads down focused work when they needed to do heads down focused work. So it really brings to the forefront the question of choice. And through the last 20 years, we've been giving more and more choice to employees in terms of type of workstation, what it looks like, what it feels like, what are the tools that they would like to use best. And technology is sort of the next wave of choice that's coming. I was just at a summit for Cornet in San Diego a couple weeks ago, and one of the big topics was bring your own technology to work. And that is something that we think will come. There will be some challenges around that, of course, in terms of security and risk and just the seamlessness of it all. But that is a theme that we're researching right now with Cornet for the 2020 summit. And it really is about, not only do we want to give employees choice about where they work and how they work all the time, but we also want to give them choice around the tools that make them most productive. As human beings, we're very dynamic in the way we work. We all work quite differently. So if we had the choice for the tools, the workspace, the settings, and how we co-locate with colleagues or with clients on any given day at any given time, would we not be more productive is really the question that we're trying to solve and answer. And all indications and all trends are sort of veering that way. How that all ends up getting managed over time is one challenge that is quite real. And what we're seeing even in organizations today, going from a 1-to-1 seating ratio to a 2-to-1 seating ratio, it's impacting management style. And so the convergence of HR and IT at the table in our design, in our architectural discussions is absolutely critical, because when we're going through changes like that, managers have to understand how to manage their people differently, because it's not about seeing people at their desk from 9 to 5. It's really performance-based work and it's results-based work. So HR also needs to be involved to understand, how are we going to measure performance for these employees, and how is that going to be, how are we going to know that that is relevant to the business? So the change management requirement in transitioning from a very static work environment to a mobile and distributed work environment is active right now. And organizations who aren't undergoing the change management aren't having any success with distributed work. But as we know, there are organizations, as I said, there are still high panels in many organizations. And so different organizations are at a different point of their maturity as an organization, their risk tolerance as an organization. It is upper management, middle management letting go. So as I mentioned earlier, some organizations who are more control and hierarchy focused are having a more difficult time making those transitions, because it is about control and it is about seeing the people. Those organizations who are early adopters tend to be more entrepreneurial. They have a younger demographic of employee in some cases, or obviously a lot of organizations who are more technology-based tend to be early adopters as well, because they understand and they trust the technology that's going to support different ways of working, and as you mentioned earlier, plug and play, which it is becoming more and more seamless, and it's absolutely critical if we're going to continue to move in that direction.
So Lisa mentioned earlier on the assigned kind of spaces. So at Cisco, we have a number of assigned spaces. So you kind of know where you're supposed to sit, but they're not dedicated. And I know that sounds like a very small nuance, but that means if I'm late, someone else sits in my office, then I can't really tell them to get out, because it's an open shared concept. We do not do hoteling, because then you have to sign in and register and actually proactively reserve space, and we don't have enough patience for that, I think. So tying that into people, and you already talked about this, we as human beings tend to care about a picture of our family and creating our own environment, and this is maybe a generational thing as well. So how, as a design firm, where maybe 15 years ago you just designed space, now is change management becoming part of your job? How do you see that shifting?
Change management is definitely becoming part of our job, and certainly it goes in parallel with the very early discussions of any project and all the way through that process. And those are some of the topics that come up. One is sense of place and placemaking. And it is a real concern. Change at any level is always a concern for employees, and when they haven't experienced it before, it's even more frightening. So a lot of the projects that we're getting involved with now, and Canada is definitely a bit of an incubator for pilots, because most of our organizations here, if they're not headquartered here, they have smaller regional offices, or if they are headquartered here, they're seeing what's happening in the marketplace, so they're influenced by trends in the marketplace. And a lot of pilot projects are being done in Canada right now, a lot in the financial sector. They do have the depth of pocket to test and try pilots, and they want to be leaders, aggressive in their own right. And what the pilots do is allow us to go through a series of, establish a strategy for the organization that makes sense. If it's an organization who is still in private offices or some open workstations, and it's really the next step for them is bringing the walls down and opening up the space so that there's more transparency and accessibility to senior management, but also more collaboration between staff, then that's one shift that we would take them through, whereas other organizations are ready to go to a distributed work model. So understanding the readiness of the organization and where they're at in the evolution of their workplace is really important as a starting point, setting the goals and strategies that we would like to employ and test, and then going through a pilot project and building out a pilot project for a small percentage of staff to test and try. And then that pilot then becomes the change management tool to then proliferate to positive outcomes and the success of that model. And 9 times out of 10, and if I can use another metric, generally 95% of the pilots result in incredibly good success stories that actually enable organizations to take that pilot and proliferate that concept across their organization. One that we did not too long ago for Bank of Montreal, very similar, which was an alternative workplace strategy. They've actually exceeded the ratio of people to seats that was set forward within a 3-year period. And they're continuing to introduce that concept across their portfolio because of the success of it. And we did a post-occupancy survey of that pilot about 6 months after it was in place, and 95% of the employees said they would never go back to how they were working before. So it's really difficult to convince people to work, what the workplace could be without them actually testing it out, and the pilots are a really great way for change management, and one that we're utilizing across the board with most of our projects.
When we did, with your help, I think probably 8 years ago, our first major pilots in San Jose, we had people threatening to quit because of what was coming at them. But then once the space was done, people not only came more often to the office, so that we'll talk about that in a second in terms of working from home versus being in the office, where you look at these spaces, people probably want to come back to the office. But we had people from neighboring buildings just pick up their stuff and come and sit in this new environment because of all the benefits you just talked about, collaboration, interaction.
Well, that brings up a couple of points, because space is really being utilized as an attraction and retention tool. So when organizations are faced with change, and there's a chance that they're going to, there's the fear of losing the legacy and the thought leadership within the organization, but they also, at the same time, they want to attract the younger demographic, the cream of the crop, the up and coming generation of workers. So there's a fine balance that needs to be struck there. And again, there's sensitivity around how that change management and communication around the benefits of these opportunities are presented to staff, and getting staff engaged in the process so that we understand where the sensitivities are. And if it is middle management or upper management not knowing how to manage their people, and that is a very big topic, that becomes an HR issue where we need to get some training in place to make sure that they're comfortable and that it's supported. The other key ingredient to success is making sure that we have an ambassador at the C-suite who is going to walk the talk and who is going to embrace the new concept in a way that isn't as hierarchical as it has been in the past. Not to say every CEO is going to sit out in the middle of the floor plate, but they might be in a much more modest, open concept enclave at the end of a building where there's a little bit of visible privacy, but not a complete separation from the rest of the organization. One client that we've worked with just recently, the president chose to sit in an office, but fairly centrally located within the floor plate, and the office was considerably smaller. Historically, the president would have meetings in his office and have a lineup out the door, and it would be meeting after meeting, 6 to 8 people. And the behavior that changed as a result of sitting out in the middle of the floor with only the ability to meet maybe one other person ad hoc at the desk was that he was now moving around the office, going from meeting room to meeting room, depending on the need of the meeting. He was visible, he felt accessible, staff felt like he was in the office, and they felt that they were connected to senior management of the organization. And certainly for, I think this is cutting out, certainly for the millennials and upcoming generations, that accessibility to senior management is very important to them, and it's very real, because I think they feel that they have access to all the information that we have access to. They have a different sense of entitlement to be participating and circling with senior management and all levels of the organization. So that's certainly another one. And the other, other than attraction and retention, we also have to look at the impact of multi-generational workforce. Right now we have 5 generations in the workforce and soon to be 6 generations working in the workforce. How they interface with technology is dramatically changing the needs of the organization and how technology is supplied. So the flexibility, and this begs the question of bring your own technology to work. The flexibility, the intuitiveness that some generations have with technology is very different than some of the former generations who are leading in those organizations. So bridging the gap of discussion around the tools and the technologies that are available to staff, how seamless that is within the office environment is really critical, in particular in collaboration spaces. If they're bringing their technology to work and that's for their individual use, that's one thing. But within a space such as this one, having technology that's really, really intuitive and that everybody can access equally is important. So we may have somebody, sort of boomer might need training, whereas a millennial may just feel that technology is already outdated and isn't interested in using it, would prefer to bring their own. So there's a really big shift on the technology side relative to a multi-generational workforce that we're having to address. And one of the students doing their master's at Georgia University was speaking on this at Cornet. And there's a fear that millennials really only want to use technology so they don't have to be in the office, and that there's this fear that they're not going to be working and they're going to be sitting in Starbucks and just chatting with their friends. And he said, the reason we wouldn't come into the office to use the technology there is because our technology at home, in our basement or our studio apartment, is better. So technology I think is going to become a topic of the future, certainly in how it's going to impact how we work, how we collaborate, and also how we bring new generations into the workforce in a way that is meaningful and seamless. Certainly, there are huge gaps today, and I don't have all the answers in terms of where the technology is going. You could probably answer that question, but it's exciting, and the unknown is also something that we're researching with the Cornet 2020 paper as well.
So we have adopted, Cisco has adopted the bring your own device model because of the same reasons. Obviously, almost all of us are very techno savvy, so we do want a new phone and a new laptop much faster than the enterprise can provide. So we're basically providing the infrastructure and the capability to consume email and content and all our tools, but then the platform on which you do it is up to ourselves. So you'll see some of us with our iPads or playbooks or our own tablets. Our mobile phones are our own, so you pick and choose whatever you want. But that means the delineation of where you as an enterprise draw the line and where you have to secure it and make sure it's safe and only the right people can access it is something we have to we have to reset the bar, if you will.
Yeah, two of the topics that came up, and I don't know how realistic they are, but they certainly came up through the research, was one, mobile data centers for organizations as being a possibility. And the other one is a completely outsourced IT service provider that would service any type of a device that's knowledgeable of all devices, so that interconnectivity is, you know, you're calling the third party when you need an IT service support.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about technology in a second, so I'll just briefly pause and so far there's any questions or comments for Lisa or conversation. So you have, Greg?
Yeah, just wondering if you can comment in general on how like some of these spaces that you talk about will affect the actual building construction. Like presumably you need things like wireless access points, and you would need to choose your materials in such a way that you minimize interference. And is that something you're involved in? And so if you want some details on that?
Sure. There are a couple of things that are impacted today, even at a 2-to-1 ratio. We have to look at making sure that the HVAC is really suited to a space that's at full capacity. You know, with 40% on average underutilization, we're all, you know, there are already complaints about HVAC, good quality air in a lot of the traditional buildings that exist, not so much in the newer buildings, but we have a huge portfolio of existing buildings that, you know, from a sustainability perspective, we want to repurpose. So HVAC is definitely something that needs to be considered, you know, at the time that a client is either renovating or moving into a space, and making sure that we're not only designing the HVAC system for day one capacity, but we're actually designing the HVAC system in that tenanted space, or in a building if the occupant and tenant occupies the entire building, that it's going to satisfy the needs over the period of ownership or over the period of a lease, to make sure that if they go to a 5-to-1 ratio, that capability is there, rather than having to renovate after. So sort of is a cost that needs to be built into the capital improvements process at the beginning of the project. Not that it's not unattainable after, but it's a very costly thing to do, retrofit after the fact. So HVAC is a big one. The other one is acoustics. When we have people that are working in 34 square feet per person at a benching, in a benching model. So for example, it would be at this length of table, we would have, it would be a little deeper, we would have people working on both sides of that table with a bit of a modesty panel in between. They may have 48 inches or 36 inches of lineal space. They're there, they're touching down, they're on their headset. Noise and acoustics are absolutely critical in the open plan environment, and particularly as the footprint keeps decreasing. And so there are a number of studies around white noise certainly white noise satisfies the acoustic issue, but just recently there's been some research to indicate that white noise isn't necessarily good for concentration and productivity long term, and it actually impacts the way you think. So there's some studies being done on that. I don't know that there have been any conclusive results yet. But there's another type of acoustical solution which is called pink noise. And what pink noise does is it actually warbles the sound at about a 5-foot distance from the conversation. So I would be able to tell that you are speaking 5 feet away from me, but I wouldn't actually be able to make out the words. It's the way it sends vibration through the sound waves that actually warbles the sound. So pink noise is a little bit more of the rage right now in terms of, you know, a solution around acoustics. And then the other element to answer your question about materiality is looking at really good quality acoustical materials. So, you know, ceiling tile, it's more of an investment. So where you're not spending on building walls and doors and private offices, you should be spending on putting in good quality acoustical tile, some soft surfaces, acoustical panels to absorb some of that noise, so you don't end up in a loud environment. But what's most interesting is that once employees move to an open environment, there is a certain etiquette that is established. Some organizations need to publish an etiquette playbook, but there is an etiquette that's established because you can see your colleague. You know if they're on the phone, and you automatically, because you can see them now, versus when the panels were high, you automatically lower your voice out of courtesy to your colleague. And you're understanding if people are in a very heads down type of work setting, or whether they're collaborating and in more of a project team meeting type of format. So you adjust your behavior accordingly. The visibility of being able to see people across the way is really, really changing behavior naturally. So within 6 months of move-in, most people adapt very, very quickly to those behaviors. If there is a meeting environment that needs, a meeting or conversation that needs to happen, we're designing more collaborative space and more telephone rooms and more enclaves that are semi-enclosed or enclosed to deal with the acoustics, but also to deal with just the need for meeting and the need for team and group work. So the square footage that is saved in going to open plan or a smaller work setting for the individual, which we call me space, is going to we space, which is collaborative work settings, project rooms. They could be lounge enclaves or cafes that are also double as workspaces. And just as we know that mobile work started, the distributed work process, people working from home, we're now seeing third and fourth places. So people working in cafes and Starbucks and libraries. And those environments are actually influencing the look and feel and the expectations within the workplace. So people are looking for that architectural variety and landscape within the workplace that they see in just urban settings, and how they're working in third and fourth places now.
So I think it was about 10 years ago where BOMA, Building Owners and Managers Association, called out that I think the average space per worker is about 220, 240 square feet. Whereabouts would you design to now?
If we're in a 1-to-1 ratio, we're probably looking 1 seat to 1 person, employee. We're looking at the average of being about 150 square feet per person. There are some extremes at 200 square feet per person, and that might be where, for example, we're designing for a law firm and they have half a floor or full floor dedicated to client services and client conference areas. But that's highly unusual. 200 square feet per person in a law firm, but most other organizations, other than wealth management and private investment, tend to be about 150 square feet. If we're looking at call centers, again, environments where there's a lot of repeatability and people are still quite dedicated and tethered to their desk, we're looking at a smaller footprint because they're technology enabled, they're not storing anything, and that could be anywhere from 100 to 120 square feet per person, call center type of environment. So there's quite a range, but it's considerably lower than it was certainly late 80s and early 90s. Where we're looking at a 2-to-1 ratio, we're actually not looking at square footage per person, we're looking at square footage per person served. So we could be doing anything from 100 to 140 square feet per person served in those types of environments. So if we look at 40% shared seating on a floor plate, we could get that square footage to 100 square feet per person served.
So to Greg's question then a little bit is, I guess buildings are built with a life of 50 years, in Europe, 150 years. The systems in it, 20, 25 years, the workplaces, 10, maybe 5, if that long. But then the devices I rely on in terms of what I do on a day-to-day is 1 year or 6 months. Mm-hmm. And you talked about the shift, and that may be in a 10-year, right? From 250 square foot or 220 square foot to 100 square foot. That means not only the building stock, but when we build new buildings, we have to think about a whole different set of parameters to build in that flexibility. Mm-hmm. Because of moving around, changing spaces, and changing the way we work. And are these two worlds, have they met? And is that happening?
They're starting to meet, and the economics around it are starting to make sense. The economics always drive a lot of the decision making, as we all know. So demountable wall systems in lieu of conventional drywall are becoming more and more prevalent, and the systems themselves are becoming more well designed so that they are demountable quite easily by staff and facility managers without having to bring experts in every time. So that's one area where certainly there's a lot more flexibility. But even how we master plan organizations now is quite differently. We're locating a lot of the infrastructure at the core because the core is static. We know it's not changing, rather than at the window. We're moving people closer to the windows for access to natural light and health and well-being. We're introducing a lot more glass if we do have enclosed rooms, so that even if you're an internal office backing onto the core of the building, there is one view and accessibility to people, but also there's still a view to the exterior as well. You may not get natural light proliferating right to the core because a lot of our buildings, at least in North America, are quite deep. In Europe, a lot of the buildings are longer and skinnier, so the natural light penetrates deeper into the building, and a lot of them are more campus style. So natural light is definitely, natural light access to views are one of the biggest trends in terms of sustainability. It does meet LEED criteria for a LEED credit, but it's really more focused on the health and well-being of employees, and there have been numerous studies to show that productivity is higher when you feel a sense of connection with nature and the exterior. So that interconnection is really, really critically important. Other things that are changing in terms of building infrastructure, we're not quite there yet, but if we continue to go to a shared model, for example, if we go 4 people to 1 seat, we have to look at building loading, we have to look at egress, we have to look at stairwells, we have to look at number of washrooms to people, and the base building infrastructure of those buildings will need to change. We're looking at a model in Asia right now with a client, and they don't have sort of the same stringent building code systems as we do, and certainly not from a tenant fit-up perspective. You know, base building construction goes through a code approval system, but anything that's built afterward on a tenant basis doesn't go through any type of review. And we were seeing up to 400 or 500 people on a floor plate the size of the floor plate we would have here, 20 or 30,000 square feet, and only 2 washrooms for women, 2 washrooms for men. So I'm not sure how that works. I haven't actually seen it in you know, working live. But there's, you know, those are areas where we're going to see that crunch here in North America, and you know, whether our standards are different or whether it's reasonable to have 2 washrooms for a floor. I mean, we can debate that, but you know, I think we're going to have to change the way we design buildings from that perspective. And certainly from a sustainability perspective, we're partnered with the Biomimicry Guild and looking at different ways to build building envelopes that are not only sustainable, but they're actually producing energy to support and run the building. So buildings traditionally have been consumers of energy, and I think in the future they're going to be consumers of energy as well as producers and storers of energy. So that's, you know, where the building infrastructure is going relative to sustainable workplace.
Bill?
Yeah, I have just a question on the envelope then, Lisa. I mean, we read a lot about the dynamics of the envelope, where things are now moving. It could be windows, it could be shades, opacity of the glass. Also, where the building surface exterior-wise is used as a digital media screen. Are you seeing that also in your practice?
Not so much the digital media screen. I think that's fairly unique in certain marketplaces and certainly just certain urban centers. Definitely building envelope in terms of glass. Oddly enough, I mean, we've been designing buildings, and we love buildings with curtain wall, but curtain wall, as we all know, is probably the least sustainable way to design a building if we're trying to keep heat out or cold out and keep a balanced sort of HVAC and heating and cooling system. So re-looking at the building envelope and looking at louvers and shade mechanisms that are automated, that follow sort of the sort of lighting trajectory, and they adjust annually by season as well. You know, those are all systems that are in place now that are being introduced. Some of them are working better than others, and we're really in the infancy of testing those, at least in North America. I think there's been quite a bit done in Dubai over the years, again, because there was considerable investment in brand new cities. So, but how we repurpose the existing buildings with some of that technology will be really, really interesting, and that's just starting to emerge now. If we look at if we look at how we're utilizing buildings, and if our consumption is going down in terms of square footage per person, and we know that we can maximize the existing infrastructure we have here, then the focus should be on renovating and storing and repurposing existing infrastructure rather than building new as much as possible. There will still always be a need for new because of speed and also because of cost, but hopefully we will be repurposing as much as possible from a sustainability perspective. I don't know if that answered your question.
Oh, that's great, thank you.
Okay.
So, is this not working anymore?
Speak right into the top.
This technology. Just one of the kind of a last question, and then maybe one more from the audience. We talked a lot about work, workplace, office environments. Are you seeing similar trends in educational facilities? We're going to visit the George Brown College this afternoon, which is still under construction.
But in education and in health and in other kind of sectors, we're going through the same cycles?
So we touched on it earlier. I didn't really speak to it at any length of time, but the focus, again, has shifted from just buildings to people interacting in buildings. And the people focus is becoming really, really powerful because organizations want to make sure they have the best and the brightest. They now understand that healthy employee is a productive employee. They've looked at the cost of absenteeism. They understand that an engaged employee is 7 times more productive. So there's been a lot of research about how people interact in space and sort of social dynamics of the workplace over the last 10 years. And what that's going to do is drive some of that change. Sorry, going back to, I just lost the one topic that you...
No, just in terms of if you see the same trends in health, education,
right,
other facilities.
So what we're seeing in the workplace is also prevalent around people in healthcare as well as higher ed. MIT is actually focusing on the way students learn and behave in classrooms. So they're moving away from a traditional auditorium style environment because of technology and because of the way people are learning, the way people are researching, the way they're interacting. And they're going to a classroom that is one level, that has mobile furniture, that has multiple technologies. You can tether in from another location, or you can attend in person. And so the flexibility that we're asking for in the workplace is no different than in any other physical environment. And the reason that's all happening at the same time right now is because technology is enabling us to do that. So that's one example with MIT. So those classrooms, if I remember the stats correctly, they had about 60% of engineers dropping out on a regular basis out of a course at MIT, 40 to 60% by the end of the first year in terms of dropout rates, and they couldn't understand particular courses, they couldn't understand why. And so by changing the type of learning and the flexibility of learning within the classroom, the dropout rate, I think, is only about 5%. I'm going to forget those stats, but it was such a distinct difference that it gets your attention. You understand that if students can't work with technology within the classroom and be functional and work the way that they want to work, they're just not going to go. And by virtue of not going, they end up pulling out of the program because they're not learning. So MIT has done a lot of research around that, and it's probably easy to find on the web if you want to get the true stats. Similarly, in healthcare, in order to benefit patients, we're looking at how we benefit employees to benefit patients. And it's called, the sneaker time. So reducing sneaker time, reducing the walk from one end of a healthcare facility all the way to the other end of a healthcare facility in order to treat 2 patients. How do we do that? So we really need to look at workflow and the adjacencies between functions within hospitals to better utilize the space that's there, but also shorten that distance of medical professionals getting from one place to the other rather than actually treating the patients. So it really is about speed. It is about connectivity. Can they share patient information through technology so they don't have to go and talk to somebody at the other end of the facility? And looking at all of those connections in an integrated way.
Yeah, Miguel?
Do you take also the installation of solar panels or solar heating, warm water into regard?
Absolutely, and I think that's certainly in place in geographic areas where it makes sense, and where there's wind power, where there's sun.
No, I mean in your building in the city, there are lots of areas on the rooftop where it could be placed.
There is, and interestingly enough, in Toronto we don't have as much capability for solar energy as some other areas. Northern Canada is much better for solar energy, even though it's cooler. There's more sun, more days of the year. So that's probably not the best use in terms of maximum output in terms of solar energy. But one of the concepts, a very simple concept that's being introduced in new buildings in Toronto, and we just did it for a client for Honda Canada's headquarters up in Markham, is a white roof system. So the white roof actually reduces heat load anywhere from 30 to 40%, and generally your air intake is on the rooftop. So your air intake was next to a black rooftop where the air was 3 times the natural temperature at street level, and you're pulling in that hot air that's 3 times hotter into your cooling system, only to spend money to cool it, and only then to force it down from the ceiling to occupants. So an underfloor system, pushing cool air up, getting the best air at desk level. Those are all sort of base building infrastructure changes that we're seeing in buildings today, and that will only get better as we understand how they work and what the challenges are.
I find this very fascinating, and we could talk for hours, but
There's
I think we need to wrap it up. I think the comment you made at the end was around kind of people-centric buildings, and maybe that sounds obvious because haven't we always been building buildings for people? But it sounds like more than ever before, I think what people do and how they want to work and where they want to work really starts to dictate from inside out how we design space, how do we design the envelope, how do we design the building, and how do we design the communities. And this is, I think, where we see technology, and we talked about it, mobility, bring your own device, becomes such an important trigger for change of what spaces we need, what buildings we need. And that's why we thank you, Lisa, for your insights from a workplace perspective. HOK wrote, one of your colleagues wrote a book about workplace, and there was a nice write-up on Cisco in it, so we'd love to share one with you before you leave today. And also we have, I think, another hour and a half or 2 hour break over lunch. I'd like to invite you, if you're interested, we kind of do a little walk through our office. Although it's 5 years old, it's probably already dated in so many ways, but some of the concepts that Lisa talked about is open space, white noise, indoor offices, same size, a lot of glass. We have all deployed here, so whoever is interested, we'd be happy to kind of show you a little bit around in our work environment. So,
I want to touch on one thing since we're talking about Cisco, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The other thing outside of square footage and cost and utilization is brand and architecture, what we call brand in space, brand in the workplace. And as you're walking through, if you do the tour of Cisco, brand authenticity in the workplace is absolutely crucial for attraction and retention. And any new employees are basing a decision on brand alignment. If you walk into someone's reception area and they say that they're an open, friendly, collaborative workplace, and it is staid and structured and enclosed, and there's no visibility to windows, you're not treated very well, that brand disconnection is immediate. And now with the proliferation of social media and a web presence, even more critical that all elements of your brand in the workplace, in the media, on the website, through social media, how your people are representing the firm, it all has to align really critically. And why that's important in space is because people spend 8 to 10 hours of their day or longer in the workplace, and if they feel that there's a disconnection between how they're supposed to behave and how they're told the company's expecting them to behave, that creates a huge challenge culturally within the workplace. And as we all know, culture really, really drives engagement, and it drives people to remain happy employees.
Great, thanks. I think what Lisa's asking, if you later see our space, go tweet how great our space is, so that we can attract next generation engineers. So thank you, Lisa, for your time this morning. Lisa, you're going to be around for like 20 minutes or so, so if anybody has some questions or wants some time with Lisa, please do so, and we start again in about 20 minutes.
We do.
Great, thanks.